The chamber lights flickered red before the final word was even spoken. I stood in the observation ring of the Concordat Council Hall, my hands pressed flat against the cold rail, listening to a vote that would end everything my people had built. My name is Kale Threst Naira. I was a junior officer of the Varinthi fleet, sent to witness what my elders believed would be a routine review. It was not routine. It was an execution, dressed up in polite language and delivered by species who once called us friends. The Speaker of the Council, a tall, gray-skinned thrall named Orson Vaughn, read the resolution without looking at our delegation. His voice was calm, almost bored, as if he were reading a shipping manifest instead of a death sentence. The Varinthi Directorate has failed to meet its tribute quota for 3 consecutive cycles. By majority vote, the Council withdraws all protected status, all defense guarantees, and all trade privileges previously extended to the Varinthi people. I remember the silence that followed. Not shock, just silence, the kind that comes when something has already been decided long before the vote was cast. I looked across the chamber floor, searching the faces of species we had once bled for. The Korvath, whose colony ships we had escorted through pirate space 3 generations ago. The Illith Congress, who had once called us the Shield of the Outer Rim after we turned back a raider fleet that would have wiped out their homeworld. Not one of them met my eyes. Not one of them raised a hand in protest. Our ambassador, an elder named Vashtu Rel, rose slowly from his seat. His voice carried the weight of every promise the Concordat had ever broken. "You built this council on the idea that no species should stand alone," he said. "Today you have proven that idea was always a lie." No one answered him. The vote had already passed. The debate, if it could be called that, was over before it began. Within the hour, our fleet received formal orders. Disarm all border defense platforms. Withdraw all long-range patrol ships. Surrender access codes for our planetary shield network to Concordat inspectors, who would confirm compliance within 72 hours. It was not protection. It was disarmament, wrapped in the language of bureaucracy. I did not understand the full danger until I saw the sensor reports. The moment our protected status was revoked, something moved. Ships that had lingered quietly near our border for months, ships we assumed were simple traders or scouts, began to reposition. Their formations were not random. They were tightening, like a hand closing slowly around a throat. The Drakun Compact had been waiting. I realized, standing there in the observation ring, that they had known this vote was coming long before we did. Perhaps they had even encouraged it. I left the council hall in a state I can only describe as controlled panic. My ship, a small diplomatic cruiser named the Aelith, was still docked at the outer ring. I ran through the corridors, past delegates from a dozen species who did not so much as glance in my direction. To them, we were already a closed matter, a line item removed from a ledger. Aboard the Aelith, my crew was waiting. 6 of us, all young, all far from home, all suddenly responsible for carrying the worst news our people had ever received. Our pilot, a quiet engineer named Doran, looked up as I entered the bridge. "Kale," he said, "tell me it isn't true." I could not tell him that. I could only give him the order to set course for home, and to do it quickly, because for the first time in my life, I did not know how many hours we had left before something worse than silence found us. During the return flight, I did something that violated every rule of diplomatic protocol I had ever been taught. I opened a wideband transmission, one that would reach far beyond Concordat space, into territories we had never formally contacted. I did not do this because I believed anyone would answer. I did it because I had nothing left to lose. I sent the message to every frequency our old star chart still listed, including one marked only with a designation from decades past, a species called humanity, a species the Concordat rarely mentioned, and when they did, always with a kind of dismissive amusement. Reckless, emotional, unpredictable, not fit for serious diplomacy, they said, not a species worth taking seriously at all. I did not care what the Concordat thought of them. I only cared that they were far enough away, and different enough, that they had never signed the tribute quota agreement. They owed us nothing. They had no reason to answer. My message was simple. I did not dress it up with formal titles or careful diplomatic phrasing. I recorded it in my own voice, tired and unsteady, because I did not have the strength left to sound official. This is Kale Thres Naira, of the Varinthi Directorate. Our protection has been withdrawn by the Galactic Concordat. Hostile forces are already moving toward our border. We do not know if this message will reach anyone who can help. We do not know if anyone will choose to answer. If you receive this, know that we are not asking out of strategy. We are asking because we are afraid, and because we have nowhere else left to turn. I sent it. And then I sat in the dim light of the Alith's bridge, watching the stars blur past the viewport, waiting for a reply that I fully expected would never come. The flight home took 11 hours. In that time, our sensors picked up 3 more Dracoon scout ships crossing into what had, until that morning, been protected Varinthi space. No one stopped them. No Concordat patrol intervened. The silence from the wider galaxy was total, as though we had already ceased to exist in the eyes of everyone who once called themselves our allies. When we finally reached home, the sight from orbit nearly broke something inside me. Our capital city, Ithara Prime, glowed peacefully beneath its atmospheric shield, unaware of how thin that protection had suddenly become. Families were still moving through evening markets. Children were still playing in the terraced gardens along the coastal ring. They did not yet know that the promises meant to protect them had been erased with a single vote. I stood in the docking bay long after the Alith had powered down, staring at the message log on my wrist display. No response. Not from humanity. Not from anyone. Elder Vashtu found me there, his expression unreadable in the low light. "You sent a message beyond Concordat space," he said. It was not a question. Word traveled fast among our people, even in crisis. "I did," I admitted. "I know it was not authorized." "No," he agreed quietly. "It was not." He paused, looking up at the darkening sky, where the first faint lights of patrol beacons were being deactivated, one by one, in compliance with the Council's order. But perhaps it was the only wise thing done today. I did not feel wise. I felt like a young officer who had gambled everything on a species we barely understood, one that owed us nothing, one that had never even been formally introduced to our government. As the hours stretched into a second day, and the message log remained empty, I began to believe that gamble had failed. I did not know, standing in that dim, quiet docking bay, that somewhere far across the dark distance between our stars, a message had already been received. I did not know that in a crowded control room on a small blue world, a woman named Laura Bennett had just set down a cup of coffee, replayed my recording twice, and turned to the officer beside her with a look I would only understand much later. I only knew silence. And in that silence, I prepared myself, as best I could, for the end of everything my people had ever built. The silence lasted 3 days. 3 days of watching Drahoon scout ships tighten their formation along our border. 3 days of Elder Vashtu meeting in closed sessions with the remaining council of Ithara Prime, trying to build a defense plan out of ships that had already been ordered to stand down. 3 days of families in the capital slowly realizing, through rumor and fear rather than official announcement, that the shield above their heads was thinner than it had ever been. I spent those 3 days doing what little I could. I helped reroute emergency power to civilian shelters. I helped catalog what weapons we still possessed, weapons the Concordat had not yet forced us to surrender. It was not much. Our fleet, once respected across the outer rim, had been reduced to a handful of aging cruisers and a home defense grid that had never been tested against a real invasion. On the 3rd night, I was standing on the observation deck of Ithara Prime's command tower when an alert cut through the quiet hum of the city below. Not an alarm, a signal. A single unidentified vessel had dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the very edge of our system, broadcasting on every open channel at once. My first instinct was fear. I assumed it was the Dracoon, moving early, testing our defenses before the full assault began. I ran to the command center, my heart pounding harder with every step, expecting to see warnings of incoming weapons fire. Instead, I saw something I did not understand at first. The ship was small, unarmed, as far as our scanners could tell. Its design was unlike anything in our records, blocky and practical, without the sleek elegance of Concordat vessels or the sharp, predatory lines of Dracoon warships. And it was broadcasting, over and over, in a language our translation systems struggled to fully process at first. I stood frozen at the console, reading the words as they scrolled across the screen, translated imperfectly but unmistakably. Elder Vashtu arrived moments later, out of breath, staring at the same message. "Is this a trick?" he asked, though I could hear that he did not fully believe his own question. I did not answer immediately. I opened a return channel instead, my hands trembling slightly as I keyed in the response. "Unidentified vessel. This is Ithara Prime Command. Please identify yourselves." The reply came almost instantly, as though they had been waiting for exactly that question. "This is the vessel Horizon, representing the people of Earth. We received a distress signal 3 days ago from an officer identifying themselves as Kale Thres Naira. We are here in response to that signal." I felt the air leave my lungs. My message, the one I had sent without authorization, without any real hope, had not only been received, it had been answered. Elder Vashtu turned to look at me, and for the first time since the vote that stripped away our protection, I saw something other than exhaustion in his eyes. It was cautious, fragile, but unmistakably there. Hope. We granted the Horizon clearance to approach, though not without careful monitoring. Even hope, in a time like that, had to be treated with discipline. As the ship drew closer, I requested to be part of the welcoming delegation, and Elder Vashtu, perhaps sensing that this was somehow tied to me specifically, allowed it. The Horizon docked at our secondary platform, a modest structure compared to the grand diplomatic bays we once used for Concordat visits. When the airlock finally cycled open, I did not know what to expect. Stories about humanity varied wildly across Concordat space, some painting them as brilliant, others as dangerously unstable. The woman who stepped through the airlock was neither of those things. She was simply focused. Sharp-eyed, with short dark hair, and a posture that suggested someone used to making difficult decisions quickly. She introduced herself as Captain Laura Bennett, and behind her came a small crew, no more than a dozen people, dressed in practical uniforms without the ceremonial decoration Concordat officers usually wore. "Officer Thres Naira," she said, extending a hand in a gesture I recognized from old cultural records but had never actually experienced. "I read your message myself. I want you to know we don't take it lightly." I shook her hand, unsure if I was doing it correctly, unsure of almost everything in that moment, except the strange, cautious relief spreading through my chest. "I did not expect anyone to answer," I admitted, "especially not so quickly." Captain Bennett's expression tightened slightly. "We debated fast, and we argued a lot along the way. Some people back home think we're moving too quickly into things we don't understand. But when I played your recording for our council, there wasn't much debate left after that. You didn't sound like someone asking for advantage. You sounded like someone asking for help." Elder Vashtu stepped forward, his voice careful but direct. "Forgive me if I ask a difficult question, Captain. The Concordat has told us for generations that your people are unpredictable and not suited to matters of galactic diplomacy. Why would you risk your people for ours when even our closest allies would not?" Captain Bennett did not seem offended by the question. If anything, she seemed to expect it. "Because we never signed their agreements," she said. "We're not part of the Concordat, and we never accepted their tribute quota system. To us, an entire species being abandoned because they wouldn't hand over resources isn't complicated politics. It's just wrong. We don't need permission from the Concordat to decide that." I studied her carefully as she spoke, searching for any hint of the manipulation the Concordat always claimed humanity was prone to. I found none. What I found instead was something closer to plain conviction, the kind that did not require elaborate justification. Still, not everyone shared my growing trust. Later that evening, in a private council session, several of our senior officials voiced sharp concerns. One of them, a defense strategist named Orlek Fenn, argued forcefully against accepting further human involvement. "We know nothing about them," he said. "Their technology is unfamiliar. Their motivations are unproven. For all we know, this is simply a new form of exploitation, one that arrives wearing the mask of kindness instead of tribute demands." Elder Vashtu listened patiently before responding. "You are not wrong to be cautious, Orlek. But consider this. The Concordat, an alliance we served faithfully for generations, abandoned us within a single vote. This single ship, from a species with no formal ties to us at all, arrived within 3 days of a message sent without authorization or promise of reward. I do not know their full intentions, but I know which choice, so far, has matched its words with action. The debate continued long into the night, but by its end, a cautious agreement was reached. We would allow limited cooperation with the human delegation, monitored closely, while our leadership assessed their intentions further. It was not full trust, but it was, for the first time in days, something other than despair. I was assigned as the primary liaison to Captain Bennett's crew, largely because Elder Vashtu believed my earlier message had already established a connection between us. I did not object. If anything, I welcomed the responsibility, though I understood the weight it carried. Any mistake in this fragile new relationship could unravel everything before it had properly begun. Over the following 2 days, I learned more about the Horizon's crew than I expected to. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, though several had military backgrounds. Among them was an engineer named Noah Pierce, a quiet, methodical man who spent most of his time studying our defense grid schematics with an intensity that reminded me of our own best technicians. There was also a young broadcaster named Ethan Cross, who carried recording equipment everywhere he went, explaining that part of humanity's strategy involved something the Concordat rarely valued: public visibility. If people across the galaxy can see what's happening here, Ethan explained to me one afternoon as we walked along the upper ring of Ithara Prime's central tower, it becomes much harder for the Concordat to pretend they didn't know, or that it didn't matter. Silence is easy to maintain when no one is watching. I found the idea strange at first. Among our people, and certainly among the wider Concordat, diplomacy was conducted quietly, through closed channels and careful negotiation. The idea of broadcasting a crisis openly, allowing other species to witness our vulnerability, felt deeply uncomfortable. "Will it not make us appear weak?" I asked him. Ethan considered the question seriously before answering. "Maybe to some. But it'll also make it a lot harder for the Concordat to keep pretending they had no choice in what happens next. Sometimes being seen is its own kind of protection." I did not fully understand his reasoning yet, but I chose not to dismiss it. So much of what I thought I understood about diplomacy, about strength, about who could be trusted, had already been proven wrong in the span of a single week. As the days passed, more human ships began arriving, not in the organized formation of a formal fleet, but in scattered, almost chaotic waves. Some were small independent vessels, others were modest transport ships repurposed for the journey. Captain Bennett explained that once footage of her original message reached human networks back on Earth, volunteers had begun organizing on their own, without waiting for extensive government coordination. "It's a little disorganized," she admitted, watching the growing cluster of ships on our orbital display. "But it's honest. Nobody ordered these people to come. They chose to." I stood beside her on the observation deck, watching as another small transport ship settled into orbit alongside the others, and I felt something shift inside me. It was not full certainty. Elder Vashtu was right to remain cautious, and Orlik's concerns were not without merit. But watching that gathering fleet of mismatched, unglamorous ships, arriving not out of obligation but out of choice, I began to understand what Captain Bennett had meant on the day she first stepped off the Horizon. We had been abandoned by an alliance built on obligation and quota, and in its place, something far less structured, but perhaps far more real, was beginning to take shape above our skies. I did not yet know how great a test that fragile trust would soon face. The Drakun formations along our border had not slowed their advance during those days of uncertain diplomacy. If anything, our sensors suggested they were growing bolder, perhaps emboldened by reports that a Concordat member species now stood entirely alone. Alone, except for a small, unglamorous fleet of ships from a world none of us had ever visited, gathering quietly in our skies, waiting to see if their promise would be tested, and if it was, whether they would still choose to keep it. I remember standing beside Captain Bennett on that observation deck, watching the stars, and asking her a question I had not planned to ask. "If the fighting comes," I said quietly, "will your people truly stand with us, even against a threat this large?" She did not answer immediately. When she finally did, her voice was steady, without hesitation. "We already told you we would," she said. "We don't make promises we don't intend to keep." I wanted, more than almost anything I had ever wanted, to believe her completely. But belief, I was learning, was something that had to be earned through action, not simply spoken aloud. And soon, far sooner than any of us hoped, that belief would be tested in the only way that ever truly matters. The days that followed the Horizon's arrival did not feel like the beginning of salvation. They felt like the quiet before something far larger was about to break loose, and every hour that passed brought us closer to finding out exactly what that would mean. I did not sleep well during that stretch of time. Neither, I suspect, did anyone else on Ithara Prime. Word had spread through the capital that outsiders had arrived, strange ships from a world called Earth, and the reactions among our people were as divided as they had been among our leadership. Some watched the growing fleet in orbit with quiet gratitude. Others watched with the same suspicion Orlek Fen had voiced in council, wondering what price would eventually be demanded for this unexpected kindness. I spent much of my time moving between the human delegation and our own command structure, translating not just language but intention. It was strange work. Human phrasing was often more direct than our own, sometimes almost blunt, and I found myself constantly softening or clarifying words so they would not be misunderstood by our more traditional officials. Noah Pierce, the quiet engineer, became an unexpected source of comfort during those tense days. Unlike Captain Bennett, whose role required constant diplomatic caution, Noah spoke plainly about almost everything, including his own uncertainty. "I'll be honest with you," he told me one evening, as we reviewed damaged sections of our outer defense platforms together. "I don't know if what we're doing here is enough. Your systems are old, some of your platforms haven't been properly maintained in years, and we don't have unlimited resources either." "Then why continue?" I asked him, genuinely curious rather than doubtful. He considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Because not trying isn't really an option. Not for us." Maybe that sounds simple. Maybe it even sounds a little foolish to people who are used to calculating risk before committing to anything. But some decisions aren't really about the odds. They're about who you want to be when the moment actually arrives. I found myself returning to those words often in the days that followed, especially as our combined teams worked long hours reinforcing what defenses we still had. Human engineering methods were unfamiliar to us, sometimes surprisingly improvised compared to the precise, standardized approach the Concordat had always favored. Yet what they lacked in polish, they often made up for in creativity, finding solutions to problems our own engineers had long considered unsolvable without Concordat-grade technology. Still, not every interaction between our peoples went smoothly. During one tense meeting, Orlek Fen confronted Captain Bennett directly, voicing the suspicion many still quietly carried. "You arrived quickly, and you continue sending more ships every day," he said. "Forgive my bluntness, Captain, but such generosity is rare in my experience, especially when offered so freely, with no clear demand for payment." Captain Bennett did not flinch from the challenge. "I understand the suspicion," she said. "If our positions were reversed, I'd probably feel the same way. But I'm not going to pretend we're saints either. We have our own arguments back home about whether this is the right move. Some people think we're overextending ourselves for a species we barely know, but the ones who came here, the ones sending ships, they didn't come because they expect a reward. They came because they believed it mattered." Orlek studied her carefully, clearly unconvinced but unwilling to dismiss her outright. "Time will reveal the truth of your intentions, Captain, one way or another." "It usually does," she replied simply. I admired her composure during exchanges like that, even as I understood Orlek's caution was not without reason. Trust, especially trust extended toward an unfamiliar species after such a painful betrayal, could not be built through words alone. It was action, ultimately, that began shifting even the most skeptical opinions among our people. When a critical failure occurred in one of Ithara Prime's remaining shield generators, threatening to leave an entire coastal district exposed, it was Noah Pierce and a small team of human engineers who worked through the night alongside our own technicians, eventually restoring partial function through a method none of our specialists had previously considered. It was not a perfect solution, but it held. And it held because two very different peoples had chosen to solve the problem together rather than separately. Slowly, Cautiously, something began to shift in the mood across the capital. I noticed it in small moments. A market vendor who had once eyed human visitors with open suspicion now offered a simple nod of acknowledgement when Noah passed through the district. Children, always quicker to adapt than their elders, began waving eagerly at human crew members stationed near the docking platforms. Even Elder Vashtu, careful and measured as always, seemed to soften slightly as the days passed. During one quiet evening discussion, he admitted something to me that surprised me with its honesty. "I have lived a long life, Kale," he said, watching the human fleet through the observation window. "I have seen alliances built on obligation, on trade, on fear of consequence. I do not believe I have ever seen one built simply on the choice to show up, without demand for anything in return. I do not yet know what to make of it." I did not have a full answer for him either. I only knew that whatever this new alliance was becoming, it did not resemble anything the Concordat had built during their long history of empty treaties and carefully worded quotas. But even as trust slowly grew between our peoples, the threat gathering beyond our border did not pause to allow that trust time to fully develop. Sensor reports grew more urgent with each passing day. The Dracoon formations, once cautiously distant, had begun advancing in earnest, their warships moving with the confident, unhurried pace of a predator who no longer feared resistance. Captain Bennett called an emergency joint council on the 4th day since the Horizon's arrival, gathering both human and Varinthi leadership together for the first time in a single room. "They're not testing us anymore," she said, displaying the latest sensor data across the central table. "Their formation has shifted from a blockade posture to a strike posture. Based on their acceleration pattern, we're looking at a direct assault within the next 2 to 3 days." The room fell into tense silence. Orlik Fen was the first to speak, his voice tight with barely controlled urgency. "Our defense grid, even with the recent repairs, is not equipped to withstand a coordinated Dracoon assault, not without significant reinforcement." "We know," Captain Bennett replied evenly. "That's why more of our ships have continued arriving. It's also why I need to be completely honest with you about something." She paused, glancing briefly toward me before continuing. "We are not a unified military fleet, in the way the Concordat understands such things. Most of the ships in orbit right now are independently owned, crewed by volunteers who chose to come here on their own initiative. We do not have the kind of centralized command structure you may be expecting." Elder Vashtu studied her carefully. "Then how can you guarantee they will fight together, in a coordinated defense, when the moment actually arrives?" Captain Bennett did not offer an easy reassurance. "I can't guarantee it with certainty," she admitted. "What I can tell you is that every person who brought their ship here already made the harder choice, the one to show up in the first place, knowing exactly what kind of danger they were flying into. I have to believe that same conviction will hold when it matters most." It was not the confident promise many in the room had hoped to hear, but I found myself trusting her honesty more than I would have trusted an empty guarantee. Elder Vashtu, after a long moment of consideration, nodded slowly. "Then we prepare together," he said, "and we hope that conviction proves stronger than fear, for both our peoples." Over the next 2 days, the pace of preparation became almost overwhelming. Combined teams of human and Varinthi engineers worked around the clock, reinforcing shield generators, repairing damaged weapon platforms, and establishing coordinated communication protocols between our very different ship systems. I barely slept, moving constantly between meetings, translation duties, and technical briefings, watching as 2 entirely different peoples, slowly, imperfectly, began learning how to fight as one. Ethan Cross, true to his earlier explanation, broadcast much of this preparation openly, sending footage and reports across every accessible network he could reach, including channels that stretched into Concordat space itself. I asked him once why he continued this practice even as the threat grew closer. "Because somebody needs to see this," he said, adjusting his recording equipment as human and Varinthi technicians worked together in the background. "Somebody needs to see that when your own alliance abandoned you, it wasn't the end of the story. I want the whole galaxy watching when they realize that." I did not fully grasp the significance of his words until later, when the true weight of what was coming became impossible to ignore. On the 6th day since the Horizon's arrival, our long-range sensors detected the full scale of the approaching Dracoon fleet for the first time, and the number displayed on our command screen was larger and more terrifying than anything our depleted defenses had ever been designed to face. Elder Vashtu stood beside me in the command center, staring silently at that number for a long moment before finally speaking, his voice quiet but resolute. "Send word to Captain Bennett," he said. "Tell her the time for preparation is nearly over." I did as he asked, my hands steady despite the fear tightening in my chest, and as I sent that message, I found myself thinking not of the overwhelming numbers approaching our border, but of the small, mismatched fleet gathered in our orbit, and the simple, unwavering words that had brought them here in the first place. "We stand with you." I hoped with everything I had left that those words would hold true when it mattered most. The attack began without warning, though we had known, in the deepest part of ourselves, that it was coming. I was in the command tower when the first alert tore through the quiet hum of Ithara Prime's early morning. Not the distant hum of scout ships probing our border. This was different. This was the sound of an entire fleet crossing into our system at once, their formation sharp and merciless, moving with the confidence of a force that expected no meaningful resistance. Elder Vashtu was already at the central console when I arrived, his expression grave but composed. Around him, both Varinthi and human officers worked in tense, focused silence, watching as the enemy formation grew larger on our tactical display with every passing second. "They are moving directly for the capital," Vashtu said quietly. "No probing attack, no warning shots. They intend to end this quickly." I felt my pulse quicken as I took my position at the communications console, my hands already moving to open a direct channel to Captain Bennett aboard the Horizon. Before I could speak, her voice came through first, steady despite the chaos I knew must be unfolding around her as well. "We see them," she said. "Every ship in orbit is moving into defensive formation now. Kale, I need your shield grid operators ready to synchronize with our targeting relay the moment we give the signal." "Understood," I replied, relaying the instructions immediately to our own technical teams. What followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced, even during our fleet's most difficult training exercises. Two entirely different systems, human and Varinthi, built on different principles and different technology, attempting to function as a single coordinated defense in the middle of an active assault. It should not have worked. By every reasonable expectation, the confusion alone should have doomed us before the first shots were even exchanged. And yet, somehow, it began to hold. Noah Pierce's voice crackled across an open engineering channel, calm and focused despite the mounting pressure. "Varinthi shield grid, reduce output on the northern quadrant and reinforce east. Their formation is angling to hit the coastal defense platforms first." Our own lead technician, a sharp young officer named Elira Doss, responded without hesitation, adjusting the grid exactly as instructed. It was strange, watching orders move so fluidly between two peoples who had known each other for less than 2 weeks, yet somehow finding the rhythm needed to survive together. The first wave of Dracun fighters broke through our outer detection perimeter minutes later, their sleek, aggressive vessels cutting toward the capital with terrifying speed. I watched through the observation display as the mismatched human fleet moved to intercept them, ship formations that had no formal training together, somehow finding a workable pattern, driven less by rehearsed tactics and more by sheer determined focus. I will not pretend the battle unfolded without cost. Explosions bloomed silently against the dark backdrop of space as shields failed and hulls were struck. I heard the tension rise in Captain Bennett's voice as she coordinated her scattered volunteer fleet, redirecting ships to cover gaps, calling out warnings, refusing to let the chaos become disorder. At one point, a smaller human transport ship, one I recognized from earlier days as belonging to a young volunteer pilot named Grace Whitfield, took a direct hit along its outer hull. My chest tightened as I watched the ship spin momentarily out of formation, its systems flickering across our display. "Whitfield, report your status," Captain Bennett called immediately, her voice sharp with concern. There was a tense pause before Grace's voice came through, strained but alive. "Systems are unstable, but I'm still flying. I'm not pulling back." I found myself holding my breath as she steadied her ship and rejoined the formation, continuing to provide cover for the platforms below despite the visible damage streaking across her hull. It was a small moment in the wider chaos of the battle, but it stayed with me long after, a reminder that the people fighting beside us were not simply following orders from a distant command structure. They were choosing, moment by moment, to remain in a fight that had never truly been theirs to begin with. As the battle stretched into its second hour, our combined defense began to hold the enemy's advance, though at a heavy cost. Several of our older Varinthi cruisers had already been forced to retreat with critical damage. 2 human volunteer ships had been lost entirely, their crews evacuated just moments before catastrophic failure. Elder Vashtu stood rigidly beside me throughout, watching every loss with quiet, controlled grief, though he never once suggested retreat. It was during the battle's most dangerous moment that everything nearly turned against us. The Dracoon commander, a calculating officer whose ship broadcast the designation Vorak Sen, shifted tactics entirely, redirecting the bulk of the fleet's firepower directly toward Ithara Prime's central shield generator, the single point of failure that, if destroyed, would leave the entire capital exposed. "They've identified our weak point," Illyra Doss called out, her voice tight with alarm. "If that generator falls, we lose shield coverage over the entire capital within minutes." I felt a cold wave of fear settle over me as I relayed the information to Captain Bennett, watching as the enemy formation began converging with terrifying precision toward the generator's location. "We see it," she replied immediately. "Pierce, can your team reinforce the generator directly?" "We can try," Noah answered, "but I'll need cover. If their fighters reach us before we finish, we won't have time to complete the reinforcement." There was no hesitation in Captain Bennett's response. "Every available ship, converge on the generator's position. We hold that line no matter what it costs us." What followed was, without exaggeration, one of the most extraordinary moments I witnessed during my entire life. Ships from a species none of us had known existed a mere 2 weeks earlier turned as one, abandoning safer defensive positions to protect a piece of infrastructure critical not to their own survival, but to ours. Grace Whitfield's damaged ship was among them, weaving through enemy fire to provide cover, as Noah's engineering team worked frantically against the clock. I watched from the command tower, my hands gripping the console edge so tightly it ached, as the battle around the generator intensified. Weapon fire lit the darkness in bright, sharp flashes. I heard voices calling coordinates and warnings across the open channel, human and Varinthi pilots working together, with an instinct that seemed to grow stronger with every passing minute, rather than weaker. It was Captain Bennett herself who eventually flew the horizon directly into the heart of the exchange, positioning her ship between the concentrated enemy fire and the vulnerable generator below. It was a bold, dangerous decision, one that placed her own ship directly in the most lethal path of the assault. "Captain, your shields won't hold that position for long," I warned over the open channel, unable to hide the fear in my voice. "They don't need to hold forever," she replied, her voice steady, despite the visible strain audible beneath it. "They just need to hold long enough." Long enough, it turned out, was exactly what Noah Pierce's team needed. Moments before the horizon's shields buckled dangerously low, the generator's reinforcement completed, stabilizing the failing systems just as the enemy's concentrated assault reached its peak. "Generator stabilized," Illyra called out, relief evident in her voice. "Shield integrity holding across the capital." I allowed myself a brief, unsteady breath of relief, though the battle was far from finished. Vorak Sen's fleet, having failed to break through at their intended point of attack, began regrouping, clearly reassessing their strategy in the face of unexpectedly coordinated resistance. It was in this brief lull that something unexpected began to happen. Across open frequencies, transmissions began arriving, not from our system, but from far beyond it. Word of the battle, broadcast openly by Ethan Cross and amplified across networks that stretched deep into Concordat space, had begun reaching audiences no one had anticipated so quickly. Species who had remained silent during our earlier abandonment were now watching, in real time, as a small, mismatched alliance of humans and Varinthi held their ground against overwhelming odds. I did not have time to fully process the significance of that moment. Vorak Sen's fleet, though pushed back, was already regrouping for a second assault, one I feared our already strained defenses might not survive without further reinforcement. Elder Vashtu turned to me, his expression a careful mixture of exhaustion and something that resembled fragile hope. How much longer can they hold, Kale? I did not have a certain answer for him. I only knew that whatever strength remained in that battered, determined fleet above us, it had already proven far greater than anyone, including the Concordat that abandoned us, had ever expected. The second wave of Dracoon ships regrouped faster than any of us anticipated. I watched the tactical display with a growing sense of dread as Vorak Sen's remaining formation tightened once more, clearly preparing for a final, decisive push against our weakened defenses. Their numbers are still greater than ours, Illyra Doss reported grimly, studying the shifting patterns on her console. If they commit fully this time, I do not know if our shields will hold through a second sustained assault. I relayed the assessment to Captain Bennett, bracing myself for whatever difficult decision would need to follow. Her response, when it came, carried a note of something I had not expected to hear amid such dire circumstances: certainty. "Then we make sure they don't get the chance to finish what they started," she said. I did not fully understand what she meant until moments later, when new signals began appearing on our long-range sensors, distant at first, then rapidly growing clearer. More ships, human ships, arriving in numbers far greater than the initial volunteer fleet that had gathered in our orbit over the previous days. Where did they come from? I asked, watching the sensor readings in stunned disbelief. Captain Bennett's voice carried a faint trace of relief beneath her steady composure. Ethan's broadcasts reached farther than we expected. Once people back home saw what was happening here, more volunteers mobilized. It's taken this long for them to reach us, but they're here now. I stared at the growing formation on our display, ships of every size and design, clearly assembled without formal military coordination, yet moving now with a shared, unmistakable purpose. It was not the disciplined, uniform fleet the Concordat might have sent under different circumstances. It was something else entirely, a scattered gathering of individuals who had each made the same difficult choice, arriving late perhaps, but arriving nonetheless. Vorak Sen's fleet hesitated as the new arrivals entered the system, clearly recalculating the odds of an assault that had suddenly become far less certain of success. I watched the enemy formation shift uncertainly on our display, no longer advancing with the same confident momentum they had shown at the battle's beginning. Elder Vashtu stood beside me, watching the same shifting patterns with an expression I had not seen from him since this crisis began. Something close to genuine hope. "They came back," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Even after everything, they came back." The reinforced fleet moved swiftly to bolster our strained defenses, and within the hour, the balance of the battle had shifted decisively in our favor. Vorak Sen, faced with a defense far stronger than his intelligence had prepared him for, made the calculated decision to withdraw his remaining forces rather than risk total destruction. I watched the enemy formation retreat across our tactical display, the tension in my chest finally beginning to ease for the first time in what felt like days. Around the command center, quiet, exhausted celebration began to spread among both Varinthi and human officers, though none of us fully relaxed until the last Dracoon signature disappeared from our sensors entirely. It was not, I would later learn, the true end of the conflict, but it was, undeniably, the moment everything began to change, not only for the fragile new alliance between our two peoples, but for how the wider galaxy would come to understand exactly what had happened above Ithara Prime that day. News of the battle spread quickly, carried far beyond our system by the very broadcasts Ethan Cross had insisted on maintaining throughout the crisis. Species who had remained silent during our abandonment now found themselves confronted with undeniable footage of a small, seemingly unremarkable alliance holding firm against overwhelming odds, aided by a species the Concordat had long dismissed as unserious and unreliable. The reaction within Concordat space was immediate and deeply uncomfortable for those who had voted to abandon us. Reports reached us within days that several member species, embarrassed by the public exposure of their earlier inaction, had begun quietly pressuring the Council to reconsider its decision. I felt little satisfaction in their discomfort. Whatever guilt now motivated their reconsideration, it had arrived far too late to change what had truly mattered during our darkest hours. Elder Vashtu was called before an emergency council session less than a week after the battle's end, this time accompanied not only by our own diplomatic staff, but by Captain Bennett herself, representing humanity's newly acknowledged role in the events that had unfolded. I attended as translator and witness, watching as the same chamber that had so casually voted away our protection now scrambled to reframe its earlier decision. Speaker Orson Vaughn, visibly uncomfortable beneath the weight of galaxy-wide scrutiny, addressed the reconvened council with far less confidence than he had shown during the original vote. In light of recent developments, he said carefully, the council wishes to formally reconsider the status of the Varinthi Directorate and to extend renewed protections under standard Concordat guidelines. Elder Vashtu did not respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the desperation it once might have held during our darkest days. "We appreciate the Council's willingness to reconsider," he said. "However, I must ask a difficult question. Where was this concern for our protection before an entirely unaffiliated species chose, of their own will, to stand beside us? Would this reconsideration exist at all, were it not for the discomfort of being publicly witnessed abandoning an ally?" The chamber fell into an uneasy silence. No one offered a satisfying answer, because none existed. I watched as several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unable to meet Vashtu's steady gaze. "We do not reject renewed cooperation with the Concordat," Vashtu continued, "but I believe it is time for my people to reconsider exactly where our loyalty is best placed. Protection built on obligation, one that vanishes the moment convenience demands it, is not protection at all. What we experienced above Ithara Prime was something far more meaningful, offered freely, without demand for tribute or quota." It was Captain Bennett who spoke next, her voice calm but firm as she addressed the assembled council. "Humanity isn't seeking to replace the Concordat, or to position ourselves as some new galactic authority. We simply believe that when someone asks for help, and you have the ability to give it, you don't need a treaty to justify doing what's right." I do not know how deeply her words truly resonated within that chamber, filled as it was with species long accustomed to calculated diplomacy over simple conviction. But I saw, in the days that followed, a subtle shift beginning across the wider galaxy, as more species began quietly reaching out to establish contact with humanity, driven not by formal treaty, but by the undeniable example set above our skies. For the Varinthi people, the aftermath of that battle marked the beginning of something entirely new. Rather than returning to the familiar obligation-bound structure of Concordat membership, our leadership formally established an independent alliance with humanity, built not on quotas or tribute, but on mutual respect and voluntary partnership. It was an unconventional arrangement, one that puzzled many older Concordat members accustomed to rigid diplomatic structures, but it reflected exactly the kind of relationship both our peoples had already proven capable of building under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. I remained closely involved throughout this transition, continuing to serve as a liaison between our two peoples as formal cooperation expanded. Noah Pierce's engineering teams remained on Ithara Prime for several months afterward, helping modernize our defense systems using techniques we would likely never have discovered on our own. Grace Whitfield, whose damaged ship had become something of a symbol among our people following the battle, returned frequently, eventually establishing a small training exchange program between human and Varinthi pilots. Even Orlek Fenn, once among the most vocal skeptics of human involvement, gradually softened his position, though he remained, true to his nature, cautiously pragmatic rather than openly sentimental about the change. "I do not know if this alliance will remain as steady in 10 years as it has proven in these past months," he admitted to me once, during a quiet moment following a joint defense briefing. "But I confess, I did not expect to be proven wrong so thoroughly, nor so quickly." I often found myself reflecting on how dramatically everything had changed since that terrible day in the council chamber, when an entire alliance's worth of promises had dissolved in the space of a single vote. We had been abandoned by a structure built on obligation and convenience, left to face an overwhelming threat with nothing but a desperate, unauthorized message sent into the dark, carrying little real hope of reaching anyone willing to answer. And yet, against every reasonable expectation, someone had answered. Not out of treaty obligation, not out of calculated political advantage, but out of a conviction that some choices do not require complicated justification, only the willingness to show up when it matters most. I think often of the words Captain Bennett spoke to me during our very first meeting aboard the Horizon, Words that would come to define not only the battle we survived together, but the entirely new chapter our peoples chose to build afterward. We stand with you. They were simple words, offered without the formal weight of diplomatic ceremony, without demand for tribute or promise of future obligation. And yet, in the end, they proved far stronger and far more enduring than any treaty the Concordat had ever written. I do not know what challenges still lie ahead for the alliance we built in those difficult days. The galaxy remains vast, uncertain, and often unkind to those who stand without powerful allies behind them. But I have learned, through everything my people endured, that true strength is not measured by the size of an alliance's fleet or the weight of its formal agreements. It is measured by the choices made when no formal obligation demands them. It is measured by those willing to answer a desperate, uncertain message sent into the dark, simply because someone needed help, and they were willing to give it. We were abandoned by the galaxy we had faithfully served for generations. But in our darkest hour, a species we had never even properly met chose, without hesitation, to stand beside us instead. And for that choice, freely given and faithfully kept, my people will remain grateful for as long as our history continues to be told.